Buying a house can be a tricky process no matter where you live. We bought a house in the US and a flat here in Denmark, and we were really surprised at just how different the experience was in each country.
Now, to be clear, there are certainly differences in the experience for everyone, and we can only speak to our specific and unique cases in both places. But I do think this experience shows that something that's so standard, like buying property, can surprisingly be different in these two different places. Now, before you start looking for property in either place, it's important to know some things about how the market works in both places. Here in Denmark and in the US, you usually, if you have really good credit or are considered low risk, can put down as little as 5%. When you buy a mortgage, sometimes you may have to give up to 20%. Again, when you buy a mortgage, when you buy a property, it's all about risk profile to any bank. One of the unique things here in Denmark as well is that foreigners generally have a lot more rules about buying property. Danes are a bit concerned about having property gobbled up by foreigners. So generally you have to make sure that you have a residency in the country to buy property. And generally you're going to go through some hoops as well as a foreigner, both to find a bank and going through government approvals.
Now, as far as qualifying for a mortgage, it's pretty different in America versus Denmark. In America, banks pretty much compete to get your business. They want to lend out money, and they kind of hand out mortgages like candy. Now, it's not as bad as it was before the economic crash in 2008, but banks really are still competing for you to lend you money. And it's important to have good credit. They're going to look at your credit score, which is basically a compilation of how well you have paid all of your bills in the history of time that you've had credit cards, student loans, a car payment, any kind of credit, even your electric bill, may be reported to one of the three main credit agencies that will supply a credit report to the bank. They're going to look at that, and you generally want to have a score over 750 to be considered very low risk, and that's when you're going to get the best rates. If your credit is a little bit lower than that, then you're probably going to pay a higher rate, so it's a little bit more complex. In Denmark, it's a lot more simple. They basically look at the income of the individual or the couple that are buying the property, multiply that by 4, and that's the amount of money that they'll lend out to you.
Now, it may sound like in Denmark it's just 4 times your annual salary and that's it. But where it gets complicated, especially for us as foreigners, is that banks don't necessarily want to do business with you. I mean, when it comes down to it, again, it's all about risk. And in fact, we sat down with one advisor at a bank who told us, quite honestly, they don't make a lot of money off of mortgages, and we're nothing but risk to him. That if all of a sudden the economy tanked and we lost our jobs, had to go back to the US, we may just leave the apartment and walk away from it because it's underwater. And now he's stuck with an apartment in Copenhagen, nothing to do with it. Banks don't like doing things like that. So we struggled a bit to find a bank that would approve us. A lot of them didn't want to work with foreigners altogether. I know American banking rules make things a little bit difficult as well. But it took us a little bit of time to be able to find someone. In fact, I think you called a couple different banks where you said that, hey, can we maybe get a mortgage with you guys? And they said, why don't you talk to your bank?
Yeah, so having something to compare to, we really kind of got the feeling like a lot of banks just didn't want to deal with us because we were foreigners. I get it. It's a bit more complicated. There are more hoops that you have to jump through. And we really weren't prepared for that because we kind of were used to the U.S. system where if you have a job and you have money to put down on a house and you have good credit and you pay your bills, you're going to be able to get a loan to buy a house. And it's a bit different in Denmark. You have to do almost a little bit of networking, asking around, and finding the right bank that will deal with you.
And the funny thing in the US is, at least the times I've gone through the process, I never actually met the bank that has the mortgage. That usually you go through something called a mortgage broker. They go around and find different deals that are out there for you, and it's a completely sterile process. Usually you don't meet them at all. Maybe you sign some stuff in the mail or exchange emails or whatever, but it's nothing like it was here, which seemed like a much more personal process.
Yeah, and it's a much longer video, but the reason behind that in the US is they really want to take out any possible discrimination or anything that can be discriminatory in the bank's lending process. So they want to make sure that they're almost not meeting and very far removed from the people that are applying for the mortgage so that nobody's treated unfairly or differently. And I guess you could say in Denmark, that's not the case. Another big difference is realtors or estate agents. It's definitely very different in Denmark because the buyer, the people going to buy the property, will not have, in most cases, a realtor or an estate agent with them. And in the US, you always have a realtor on both sides of the transaction. Somebody that is selling the property will have a realtor, and a realtor will represent the buyer and take them around to different open houses or arrange different visits to go and view the apartment. It's nice having that agent or having that real estate agent that coordinates all of those visits for you. Ours even drove us around and took us to lunch, and we had a really good relationship with her back in the US. We didn't have that here, and in Denmark, you don't normally have that if you're buying the property. You set up your own visits, you go to your own open houses, and they're very regimented, about maybe 20 minutes long to just kind of do a walkthrough. There's other people walking through and looking at those apartments with you. And some days when we would go out to do that, usually it was on Sundays, we would see the same people going to look at different apartments. And it makes sense because they were probably looking in the same neighborhoods, in the same price range that we were. And we would see some of the same couples that were going out and looking at apartments every weekend just like us. So that's pretty funny. In America, it's a bit different where you have that realtor actually going and coordinating all of that for you.
Yeah, the other big thing is the realtor is going to handle the negotiation for you, which is a nice thing to have a professional taking care of that. Also, a big difference in the fees. I think typically in the US, between the buy side and the sell side, it's about 7% of the selling price. Whereas in Denmark, we've heard on the buy side, or say on the selling side, it's like 1% of the selling price. So it's a big difference in what kind of commission they get.
Yeah, so the realtors in the U.S. work basically off of commission. So the more houses that they sell, or the more buying representation of buyers that they do, the more money that they're going to make. So it's a bit different than the way that the system works here in Denmark.
Now, similar to the realtor difference between the two countries is also how you look at places is different. Now, again, it may be different in different parts of Denmark. We're looking at flats here in Copenhagen, but the weird thing for us was that when you would go, like Derek said earlier, you'd go for very specific slots on Sundays. So literally, if you looked at a property that was available for sale, you'd see that there was about a 20-minute window that you'd go to it between, say, 1:20 and 1:40 in the afternoon. And like you said, it'd usually be one realtor in 4 or 5 different places. So we'd see the same people, the same realtor in the different places going around. In the US, typically it's more of a private affair that's done, say, during the day or maybe on Saturday. Saturday is kind of a typical realtor day to go around to different places. But usually you see it by yourself. There are open houses, typically, especially when a house is first in the market or if it's been in the market for a while and trying to drum up interest. But usually you look at them privately. They'll be your realtor, will talk to their realtor, set up time to go look at it where the person's not home at all, and you look at it yourself, and then you decide what you're going to do. Denmark, again, much more private affair, though you can make reservations here and look at places on your own. But usually, at least when you first start going out, you're just going to do it all on yourself.
Yeah, and the second and third time that you go to visit a property, you'll probably go and do that privately. You might be a one-on-one where you're going to go and meet the seller's real estate agent and try to get a feel for what the house is like. But it's also important that in those situations, you're asking very specific questions. Maybe you even want to bring along a contractor to understand if it's possible to remove a wall or make a second bedroom or put a wall up or swap around the kitchen. So during those later visits, it may be a bit more detailed than you would typically do in the United States.
Yeah, and that's why we brought along our friend Jakob to a couple of places, just also to get a Dane's perspective since we're new in this sort of thing. The other unique thing that kind of blew me away in Denmark, and this is a little bit the nerd in me, is the about 15-page packet that you get for every property that you see, which has all kinds of information in it. I mean, one of the interesting things here in Denmark is that the process is so transparent. That's part of why you can do it without needing to have a real estate agent on the buying side. In there, you can see all kinds of details, including how much of the mortgage is still outstanding from the current owners, all kinds of meeting minutes from the house association, if it's in a building, all kinds of other information about its history and electric consumption, everything else. It is completely transparent so that when you buy a place, you know everything you possibly can about it.
Now, another big difference is once you go and find the house that you want to move into or the flat that you want to move into, you have to go get a mortgage. And in the US, it's pretty straightforward. The most common type of mortgage, especially for a first-time home buyer, is going to be a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage with a 360 monthly payment installment setup. So you make that mortgage payment every month, and it's pretty cut and dry. In Denmark, it's a bit different where you're going to basically have a bond, and 80% of the value of the home is what you can be issued as a bond that you make quarterly payments back to. You also have to put down a deposit, so if you put down less than the 20% that would be outstanding of the purchase price, you would then get a bank loan. That's typically at a higher interest rate, and the bank loan is where you can actually make prepayments and pay that loan back early. You don't always have the opportunity to do that with the larger bond payment. You just have to make those quarterly payments, and that's it.
One of the other interesting things about that bank loan is we've been told that that's typically also a good opportunity to have a line of credit. So if you have a future improvement you want to make, so you've been prepaying against it, it's a line of credit you can use against your home as well. Now, one of the other interesting things, and again, this might be a little bit Copenhagen-centric, is the different types of apartments that you can find. Now, in the US, typically if you're buying, even in a city, you're buying a condominium or an apartment or anything like that, generally you more or less own it outright. You own the property, there's only really one kind that there is, and sure, you may have to pay some sort of monthly or annual fee to some sort of home association or building association, but generally you're independent and that's about it. So in Denmark, and this may be a little bit of a Copenhagen thing, there's really two different flavors of apartments that you can find. There's the Andellejlighed and the Ejerlejlighed. The Ejer means owner, essentially is where you own it outright, very much like the US, where you're still going to be in a building that has an association, you have to pay fees into it and make sure you go to that annual meeting to hear what changes are coming, but you own it outright, and those are the ones that are very similar to the US process. The Andel is what's different, which I would say is more aligned to, say, a co-op, and they're designed to be more affordable for people, and part of that is because it's rather fixed as far as what the cost of it can be. So they haven't appreciated in price the same way that property across Copenhagen has for the Ejerlejlighed. These can be a little bit more restrictive in what you do. If you make improvements, you're going to get that money back a little bit when you sell it, but you're not going to make a profit on it necessarily. Usually you need a few more approvals along the way because, again, you don't own it outright. You essentially have a share in the property. So you have to make sure things get approved even more than you would with an Ejer. So one unique thing for us we saw in that we only look for Ejers ourselves, and part of that is because not being Danish, not being from here, it can be a lot harder to get into an Andel, especially because they're very much governed by lists. It can be rare sometimes to see the Andels actually on kind of the public places to see what's available on the market, and that's because there's these lists that you have to get onto. Again, like everything in everything in Denmark, it's about networking to get on the list, hear what's changing up. And what's interesting is you can even move up within a building. That maybe you start with a 60 square meter, 3-room flat. As your family gets bigger, you hear things open up. You get that 4-room, 5-room, 6-room as you keep going through.
Yep, so it's a lot about your network and who you know, and it's a bit harder to get into one of those. Okay, so when it's time for you to go ahead and make that offer and you're super excited, you found the place you want to live, you'll find some differences there too. The first one is that the offer itself is different. It's actually put in by you. So when you're ready to make that offer, you're doing the negotiation, you're contacting the realtor of the seller and telling them how much it is that you want to pay. And any negotiation that happens and all of the offers that are collected then go right to the buyer and they can take whoever they want. This was a bit different for us because we didn't really have that representation. We didn't know if we were asking for too low of a purchase price. We didn't really know, and we weren't really armed for that kind of negotiation. Whereas realtors in the United States are skilled in that. They're trained in that. That's what they do for life. And being new to the process, it was a bit intimidating to have that negotiation ourselves. But once you do it and it's accepted, things move pretty fast in Denmark. At that point, you're basically making a phone call or sending an email to your bank and then one to your lawyer, and they're doing all the work at that point. And the fees are a bit less in that case too, because you're really just making sure that the taxes are caught up, you're paying the attorney fee, and you're paying any final bank fees, and that's it. In the US, there's a lot more work that goes in at that point. You're then going to have a home inspection and pay for the home inspector. If anything comes back in that inspection, you may go back to the seller and ask for a different price, or you may renegotiate the price of the house, or maybe just walk away because the contract that you signed is going to have a clause in that saying that the inspection is your point where you can opt out if you don't like what you find.
Yeah, and I guess for us what surprised us is in Denmark, everything happened immediately after you make that offer. That week is really, really crazy. In the US, things are basically, once it's accepted, it's kind of quiet for a little while until you get close to the closing time when there's all kinds of paperwork to fill out and things to take care of then.
Yeah, and the closing in Denmark is rather simple. It's basically just approving a few things electronically that come from your bank, and then you pick up the keys and that's it. You're not sitting for taking a half day off of work to sit through a long closing and sign your life away on a bunch of different papers like you do in the US.
So we mentioned that it all ends in the US with the closing, which is this big meeting that you go to and have to take off, say, half a day of work to go sit there. You literally sign your name about 785 times because everything has to be signed in triplicate, notarized, there has to be wire transfers done across. It's a surprisingly stressful day, even though you're not doing anything, because you're just there waiting to go get into your new house. You've already packed up the old place, you're ready to go, and there's a ton of money going across the wire. In Denmark, what surprised us was when you go, there is no closing because you fill out your forms ahead of time. They're all e-signs with your NMID. It's all done well in advance. The bank takes care of everything. And then when you go to pick up the keys, it actually was kind of anticlimactic. Like, we literally walked up the stairs as the seller was walking down the stairs for the last time. The realtor came here, handed us the keys, showed us a couple things, showed us the basement storage unit, and said, "Good luck." It was all done in about 6 minutes.
Yeah.
It completely surprised us. We literally took time off from work assuming this was going to be a multi-hour thing. It wasn't.
It wasn't. But we had a nice lunch after that.
It was good. It was good.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for watching, guys. If you want to see more of what a typical Copenhagen apartment looks like, you can click this video right in front of me. We'll show you what our apartment looks like. If you have more questions or are curious about banking and managing your money in Denmark, you can click on the video right in front of Mike and watch that one. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye.